Hello there everybody, welcome to another video with Mr. Longo, and this one is going to be introducing you to completing the square. So I'm going to tell you there's a lot of things you can do with completing the square. This is just going to cover the basics, and then there's going to be more videos on where you do other things with completing the square, such as solve or write equations of quadratic equations in vertex form. So there's going to be other things coming. So to start, we're just going to warm up with something old school. Expanding x plus 3 quantity squared. That just means we write x plus 3 in parentheses twice, and we multiply. And you may have called this foiling or double distributing, whatever you've called it in the past. It's basically multiplying, okay? So this is just x times x is, of course, x squared. And then you have plus your 3x plus your 3x, then plus 9. Combine the terms in the middle, and you have x squared plus 6x plus 9. So this is just the square of a binomial, which means you do it twice, and then you FOIL, draw your arrows, however you learned how to do it. It's just multiplying two binomials. But then we also learned how to factor. So factoring was when we came up with two numbers that would multiply to a positive 16 and add up to a negative 8. Well, that's x minus 4 and x minus 4. Now, they're not always the same, but when they are, that's also known as the same binomial, which we would write it like x minus 4 squared. Now, that's just a little preview to some of the things we're about to be doing. So we're going to be working with different quadratics that look like this, okay? Now, there's a pretty important skill, a little step that you have to know how to do at all times, and that's how to actually complete the square to do it. So, what number does C have to be for us to be able to factor something like this and make it look like this? So we would have x minus 4 and x minus 4. What number does C have to be to make that happen? Well, there's an easy way to do that. And you just have to take half of your b value, and then you just have to square it. So what we would do here is take half of 6, which would give us 3, and we square it, and that's going to give us 9. So we would have x squared plus 6x plus 9. And then, to write that as a square of a binomial, we would just say x, and then we just take half of this b value again. So it would be a positive 6 turns into a positive 3, and we square it. And that's how you complete the square. So to complete the square to find C, you just take half of your b value and square it. So half of 6 was 3 squared is 9. So C is 9. And then all you have to do is take your x, half of your b value, wrap it in parentheses and square it, and that's how you write it as the square of a binomial. But there is an issue. You must have the first term to be x squared. So if you have a leading coefficient, you must factor it out. So the first thing we would just do is factor out a 2, leaving you with x squared minus 6x plus our c value. Okay? So then, to find c, we would take half of 6 again, and square it. So this is technically a negative 6, but remember, half of a negative 6 is a negative 3, but negative 3 squared is still positive 9. So we're going to have 2 times x squared minus 6x plus 9. So it's still plus. But then to write it as a square of a binomial, you still leave the 2 in front. But then we're going to have x, and then half of a negative 6 is a negative 3 squared. Okay? So that's the trick. If there is a leading coefficient, you must get rid of it, regardless of what it is, which means sometimes you might actually be working with fractions. Here's another example. Same thing, we're just going to find the c value, but we need to get rid of this 1/3. So remember, when you are factoring out a leading coefficient, you're dividing. So everyone wants to say that this is 2/3, but it's not. It's actually going to be 6 again. And I was just kind of showing you how all this stuff comes about. To divide out a 1/3, we put it in front. We still have our x squared, but 2 divided by 1/3 would actually give you 6x again. I know, I'm so clever by giving you 6 every time. So then again, this is going to be 9 for C. So we have 1/3, and then we were going to just have x squared plus half of 6 we know is 3, squared is 9. So we have our 6x plus 9, and then one last time we have 1/3 times x plus 3 squared. Now, I just kind of wanted you to see what we're doing in each step. They all look different, but that middle number will sometimes change. So just be aware of that. Now, we can do that with any number. As a matter of fact, in the next couple examples, we're going to work with some different ones. So let's go see if I can show you what we're going to do with those guys. But this time, we're in equations. Now, this is where you're going to be spending most of your time. That line above was just to show you how to complete a square to find the C value. But now we're actually going to do some work with them up to one certain point. After that point, it depends on the directions. So if we're writing in vertex form, you're going to do one thing. If you're solving, you're going to do another thing. So those videos will come later. This is just to start with completing the square. So the first thing you would do is if you have a number on the left-hand side that does not have a variable attached to it, you have to move it to the other side first. So step 1 is to subtract the 4 over to the right. So we have x squared minus 12x, and this is where I say leave a little bit of room, and that's equal to a negative 4. Now this is the step where we're going to complete the square. So the first thing we're going to say now is x squared minus 12x, so half of 12 is 6, squared is 36. But when you learned about solving equations and balancing, you had to keep the equation balanced. So when you're completing the square, you added 36 to this side of the equation, so you need to add 36 to this side of the equation as well. Okay, and then you just write the square of a binomial on the left, so we would just have our x, half of a negative 12 is a negative 6, quantity squared is equal to 32, because then we would just combine that right side. So that's the trick when you start actually working with completing the squares, you have to add it to both sides. Okay, so this next one, I'm going to tell you this one's a little tricky. And not because we have, big numbers here, it's because you're going to have to work with a fraction. So as I mentioned, the first step is to subtract the 5 to the other side. So the first thing we'd have is x squared plus x, and then like I said, I like to leave a little bit of space, is equal to subtract the 5, so that's going to leave us with 5, and I'm going to leave a little space over here as well, just so we remember to write it twice. But here's the tricky part. Half of 1 is 1/2. So this leading coefficient is 1, so we actually have half of that, which is 1/2, and if we square it, 1/2 squared is 1/4. So we're actually adding 1/4 to both sides. Now don't be afraid of that. We have graphing calculators, and our graphing calculators can work with fractions for a reason. So there's no need to fear fractions. Just let your calculator do the work if you're not good friends with all these fractions. So all we're going to do now is write this as the square of a binomial. So we have our x, half of a positive 1 is a positive 1/2, squared equals. Now remember, when we add fractions, you need to have common denominators. So again, you don't have to do this in your head. You can take 5 and add 1/4 to it in your graphing calculator, change it to a fraction, and it's going to tell you that it's 21/4. If you want to remember how to do it, 5, we just need to multiply the top and bottom by 4, so that would be 20/4 plus 1/4 is 21/4. But again, I'm not going to require you to do those in your head. You will be allowed to use your graphing calculator, so if you're not a fan of fractions, just make sure you are typing it in and using it for what it's for. Use your graphing calculator, okay? So the next two are very similar again in the skill set. If you would like, pause the video and give these last two a try. You're not going to have to do completing the squares with fractions this time, but there is a very crazy step that you have to know about. So if you want to try them, give it a shot, but I'm pretty sure you're going to be tripped up. So let's see if you were able to do it. So the first thing we're going to have is that 3x squared plus 6x, and then we leave our space, is equal to a negative 3, leave a little bit of space. Just like earlier, you cannot complete the square with this, so we must factor out that 3. So now we have x squared plus 2x, leave our space, is equal to a negative 3 with our space. So half of 2 is 1. 1 squared is 1, so we're just going to add 1. But if you added 1 to this side, that's where you're going to have your little hang up, because we didn't add 1 to this side. We are multiplying it by 3. So if we were to distribute that back in, we'd have 3x squared plus 6x plus 3. So whenever you have something that you factored out, before you add it to the other side, you have to multiply. So 3 times 1 is 3. We're actually adding 3 to that side. Okay? And so then we have 3 times the quantity x plus 1 squared equals, in this case, 0. All right, so if you got that, you are on a roll and doing absolutely fine, but that little trick might have been the issue, okay? For the last example, again, the first thing we got to do is move the 2 over to the other side. So we have our 1/2 x squared minus 3x, leave a little space, is equal to 5. And then we have to factor out our 1/2. Remember, when you factor out, you are dividing. So we have 1/2 negative 3 times 2, or negative 3 divided by a 1/2. Remember, when you divide by a fraction, it's multiplying by the reciprocal. So that would actually give you a minus 6. See, he's back. Minus 6x. And then half of 6 is 3 squared is 9, is equal to 5 plus half of 9 would be 9/2, or in this case, we can say 4.5 if you really want to, but we're going to be doing most of our work with fractions, so I am going to do it the proper way and say 9/2. Okay, and then write this side as the square of a binomial, so we have 1/2, we have our x minus 3 quantity squared, is equal to 5 is technically 10/2, so we have 19/2. Okay, now for all of these questions, this is just practice. You're not going to be answering questions like this. This is just to give you an idea of what's going on. After this, you're going to have things like solve, which means then we have to start using square roots to solve. It's also going to say write it in vertex form. So you're going to move things back over to the other side, state the vertex, and you'll have a y equals. This is just the skill set you need to be successful with completing the square. All right, this is Longo and I'm out. See you, bye.